cold November morning in 1848, the judge of the Central Criminal Court in London dryly read out yet another harsh sentence. Standing in the dock was a young woman in a simple grey dress, clenching her hands so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Seated around her were wealthy gentlemen in woolen frock coats and ladies in silk gowns, awaiting the outcome with undisguised curiosity. The charge of stealing a lace shawl and silverware meant for the defendant a complete loss of reputation and expulsion from British society. Are you ready to learn the truth about how noble families got rid of their educated female servants without paying them their due wages? This trial was only a small part of the vast and carefully concealed legal system of the Victorian era. Behind the closed doors of luxurious mansions, real economic dramas unfolded, where lives were ruined for the sake of saving a few pounds sterling. We're used to thinking of the 19th century as a time of refined manners, balls, and elegant tea parties in spacious, light-filled parlours. However, the reality documented in yellowed archival files paints a completely different picture of the social structure of the wealthy island empire. This is what happens behind the closed doors of history when inquisitive researchers begin to closely examine old financial reports and court records. Today, we'll trace the journey from the first suspicions to the creation of a unique system of protection for educated, single working women. You'll witness how women tried to defend their legal rights in the harsh environment of London's criminal courts. The documents will reveal the true motives of the lords and ladies who, with surprising ease, destroyed other people's futures and careers. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn the true cost of a single piece of false evidence in the judicial system of Victorian England. What if everything you were taught about life in wealthy London homes is hopelessly outdated? Victorian society was divided into strict social classes, where moving between them was virtually impossible due to rigid traditions. A woman from an impoverished intellectual family found herself in a social vacuum between the servants and the owners of a large house. She had no right to sit at the same table as the lords, yet she could not socialize with the cooks either. This complete isolation made her an ideal target for manipulation by influential employers in the capital. In 1848, the writer Elizabeth Eastlake first drew attention to this strange social anomaly in the capital. She began gathering facts by examining dozens of lawsuits filed against single, educated women from good families. Eastlake herself moved in high society and saw firsthand how contemptuously the aristocracy treated intellectual labor performed by hired workers. In her drafts, she noted the absolute legal vulnerability of those who brought knowledge and high culture into people's homes. She was genuinely outraged by the fact that a single wrong glance could cost a woman her career and a secure home. A typical employment contract of that time offered no guarantees of job security, not even for a single short month. The employer had the legal right to dismiss a female employee at any moment, simply by citing a sudden loss of trust. At the same time, payment of the promised annual salary depended entirely on the conscience of the mansion's owner and his manager. By the end of the year, wealthy families often accumulated substantial debts to tailors, greengrocers, and coal suppliers. It was precisely then that the owners faced a tremendous temptation to eliminate the most expensive item in their monthly expenses. All it took was a minor domestic scandal, preferably involving the disappearance of some valuable trinket from the study. Silver teaspoons, silk ribbons, lace handkerchiefs, or small coins from an open desk would do the trick. The item would be quietly planted in the victim's personal trunk, after which the local constable would be summoned to conduct an official search. The evidence found instantly transformed a respectable woman into a common criminal, completely deprived of any say in the investigation. In such cases, 19th century law always unconditionally sided with the respectable homeowner of impeccable reputation. Elizabeth Eastlake personally attended court hearings to record these repetitive cases in her thick leather notebook. She noted that judges rarely demanded additional evidence beyond the confident testimony of the victim, a London aristocrat. The defendant was not provided with a public defender unless she had her own savings to cover the high fees. As a result, most of the accused were sent to workhouses, or strict correctional institutions for many months. This system operated flawlessly for decades until educated British researchers began to scrutinise it closely. It was especially difficult for women who came to London from remote counties or from abroad. They had no relatives capable of vouching for their impeccable integrity before the strict London criminal court. A letter of recommendation from former employers lost all its weight once a woman was officially charged with petty theft. A woman would find herself on the filthy streets of Clerkenwell, completely alone, without a penny to her name, and with a passport that was hopelessly tarnished. Such a reputation would forever bar her from the massive doors of respectable households throughout the vast British Empire. As she studied these cases, Eastlake clearly realized that she was dealing not with random coincidences, but with a well-established economic pattern. In the 1840s, Britain was experiencing a series of banking crises, and the middle class was striving to cut its expenses as much as possible. At the same time, a family's social status strictly demanded the presence of an educated female servant in the home to maintain outward prestige. When it came time to pay the bills, the employers chose the most despicable way to solve their temporary financial problem. Fabricating a criminal case of theft allowed them to easily save between £30 and £50 a year. The judicial system of the time did not even attempt to delve into the nuances of the relationship between employer and employee. The judge was interested in only one specific fact: who originally owned the silver object or handkerchief found in the chest. Explanations that the item had been planted there on purpose were dismissed as the brazen lies of a desperate thief trying to escape punishment. In Victorian England, private property was considered sacred, and any attempt to infringe upon it was punished with the utmost exemplary severity. Consequently, verdicts were handed down incredibly quickly, without unnecessary emotion, in-depth investigations, or lengthy cross-examinations of witnesses. Elizabeth Eastlake was determined to use the power of the written word to draw attention to this immense social injustice. She began preparing a major exposé for a prestigious magazine, carefully verifying every word and every statistic she had gathered. Her text contained no unnecessary emotion, only cold statistics on ruined lives and shattered human destinies. She wanted to strike at the sore spot of Victorian society by exposing its true financial hypocrisy in all its glory. This piece was meant to be a veritable media bombshell in the cosy living rooms of those very same respected homeowners. Eastlake's publication sparked a storm of indignation in high society, but it was now completely impossible to ignore the facts presented. The article forced many lords and members of parliament to reconsider their stance on legal protections for fair wage labour. However, completely overhauling a deeply entrenched system required not only magazine articles, but also actual advocacy organisations. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective. What do you think of this economic approach to getting rid of workers? Share your thoughts in the comments. How exactly were the main secrets of London's harsh justice system kept? The Old Bailey Court archives consisted of a vast, cold room crammed with massive oak cabinets that reached all the way to the high ceiling. Inside these dark cabinets lay thousands of dusty files, tightly bound with coarse twine and marked with red wax seals. Behind the dry bureaucratic language of each such file lay the story of the sudden collapse of someone's once perfectly calm and orderly life. It was here that independent researchers began to come in search of documentary evidence of widespread fraud perpetrated by London's elite. Among the researchers, Reverend David Lang stood out in particular, a man with a sharp analytical mind and a truly iron will. He had dedicated his life to the thorough study of social injustice in the poorest neighbourhoods of rapidly industrialising London. Lang would sit for hours at a creaking wooden archive table, leafing through the brittle pages of early 19th century court records. He was interested in the cases of single women who were suddenly accused of stealing small items from the households of the wealthy. Gradually, a frightening statistic began to emerge before him, providing documentary proof of the validity of Elizabeth Eastlake's early, sensational articles. In one of the folders, Lang found the case of Eleanor Wayne, dated a chilly November in 1848. This woman had worked impeccably in the home of a wealthy textile merchant on the outskirts of Richmond for more than 3 full years. The documents stated that her employer had suddenly accused her of stealing an expensive lace shawl from his locked study. Notably, the formal accusation was made exactly 2 days before she was due to receive a large sum of her accumulated wages. The interrogation transcript clearly showed that the constable had found the shawl at the very bottom of the distraught defendant's wooden travel trunk. Eleanor firmly maintained that the trunk had been left open in the entryway all day while she was conducting her lessons. The judge completely ignored this fact, dryly noting in his ruling that guilt had been irrefutably proven by the presence of the stolen valuable item. Lang noticed the judge's handwriting. It was hurried, as if the case had been decided just a few minutes before lunch. Such brief and extremely superficial court proceedings turned out to be the absolute norm for most of these voluminous archival cases. Lang began organizing the cases he had found, carefully jotting down the names of the chief prosecutors in a separate leather-bound notebook. He discovered that certain prominent families appeared in the court records with alarming regularity every few years. One respected London banker managed to send 3 of his educated female employees to a workhouse in a row, all on the same charge. Each time, the scenario played out identically: the sudden disappearance of silverware, a call to the police, a swift trial, and dismissal without severance pay. This was no longer just a coincidence, but a well-oiled criminal scheme to save the family's annual budget. What made this scheme particularly cruel was the fact that the stolen items were almost never worth more than a few small shillings. However, under the strict laws of the time, any theft of an employer's property was considered an incredibly serious criminal offence. Lang realised with horror that British law, intended to uphold order, had become a convenient tool for harsh social oppression. Wealthy Londoners cynically exploited the law enforcement system as a completely free way to terminate unfavourable long-term employment contracts. A single woman was physically unable to defend herself in court, since her word was worth nothing against that of a gentleman. Reverend Lang understood perfectly well that simply publishing these lists in daily newspapers was completely useless and even dangerous. Wealthy accusers wielded enormous influence in the press and could easily destroy the reputation of even the most meticulous investigator. A completely different approach was needed, one that would provide independent legal protection for the most vulnerable single women. Lang decided to join forces with Elizabeth Eastlake, whose bold articles had already laid excellent groundwork for change. Their historic meeting in the quiet library of the British Museum became a true turning point in this hidden social war. They began to develop a detailed plan to establish a special society that could provide free legal aid. The main idea was to hire professional lawyers to participate in such fabricated trials. However, implementing such an ambitious plan required enormous financial resources and the support of very influential people. Lang and Eastlake began writing long letters to well-known politicians, writers, and prominent public figures in London. The archival documents ceased to be mere dusty papers and became a powerful weapon for social reform. Their work with court records irrefutably proved that the system was in dire need of immediate and rigorous legal intervention. Eastlake and Lang were on the very threshold of creating a unique organisation, the likes of which had never before existed in the world. But how exactly did they manage to convince wealthy patrons to sponsor the defence of those whom society had grown accustomed to despising? In the next chapter, you'll learn exactly what diplomatic manoeuvres Lang had to resort to in order to save thousands of lives. A secret passed down from generation to generation holds that true power lies hidden in the quiet offices of patrons. David Lang understood perfectly well that any open conflict with the aristocracy would lead to the inevitable collapse of his noble cause. He couldn't simply accuse the London elite of fraud. Otherwise, his ambitious project would instantly be stripped of funding. In 1843, Lang officially founded the Society for the Aid of Educated Women, carefully choosing every word in its charter. The new organization's documents contained not a single word about opposing employers or fighting false accusations. On the contrary, the society stated that its primary goal was to help those who had accidentally found themselves in difficult and unforeseen life situations. This gentle approach quickly attracted noble women to the project, as they were very fond of hosting public charity soirees. None of them even suspected that part of the funds raised would secretly go toward paying for defense attorneys for the accused. Elizabeth Eastlake fully took on the challenging role of chief negotiator with the arrogant representatives of London's high society. She regularly attended dinner parties in Mayfair, where, amid light conversation about the weather, she tactfully shared the stories of the society's charges. Eastlake masterfully omitted details about the women's cruel masters from her stories, focusing exclusively on the women's own suffering. This clever tactic worked flawlessly. Wealthy lords eagerly wrote checks to feel like great social saviors. Thus, the Society's fund began to grow very quickly, with substantial pounds sterling from Britain's most influential families. One of Lang's greatest achievements was his remarkable success in enlisting members of the royal family themselves to actively support the Society. He sent a long, respectful letter to Queen Victoria, vividly describing the hard labour and modesty of British female wage earners. The Queen, who sincerely valued strict order and women's education, agreed to become the official patron of the New London organisation. Her illustrious name in the headlines of printed brochures instantly made donations to the Society's fund a matter of honour for the entire aristocracy. Now, no judge in the capital could simply brush aside a lawyer hired by this incredibly influential organisation. Having secured substantial funding, Lang began to assemble a professional team of dedicated young lawyers. He sought out ambitious litigators willing to boldly take on complex criminal cases for the sake of professional experience and the restoration of justice. These lawyers were paid slightly less than at large firms, but they gained access to the most high-profile trials. Their main task was to thoroughly investigate all the circumstances of each reported theft before the official hearings began. They visited mansions, interviewed the servants, and looked for the slightest inconsistencies in the initial statements of their wealthy clients. The initial results of these lawyers' work completely exceeded all of David Lang and Elizabeth Eastlake's wildest expectations. Astonishing things began to happen in London's courts. Confident prosecutors began to contradict themselves under the pressure of well-crafted questions. The lawyers methodically dismantled the fabricated stories, proving the absolute physical impossibility of the accused maids having committed the thefts. The judges, seeing before them an official representative of the Royal Society, were forced to order more thorough investigations and hearings. The number of acquittals in cases involving the disappearance of silver and handkerchiefs began to rise rapidly with each passing month. This sparked deep underlying discontent among those employers who were accustomed to quickly resolving financial problems the old-fashioned way. Some lords attempted to publicly discredit Lang, calling his respected society a gathering of radicals and dangerous troublemakers. In London's exclusive clubs, heated debates began over whether a female wage earner had any right at all to professional legal representation. However, none of the aristocrats dared to speak out openly against an organisation under the patronage of Queen Victoria herself. Lang brilliantly won this political battle by using the very system's strict rules against the system itself. Eastlake tirelessly continued her work in the press, regularly publishing detailed reports on the Society for the Protection of Women's successful cases. She beautifully portrayed the acquitted women as models of fortitude and Victorian virtue who had suffered terribly as a result of a tragic investigative error. These emotional articles shaped a new public opinion, compelling readers to sympathise not with the wealthy landowners, but with the accused victims. The press became a vital tool for exerting direct pressure on the courts, making the trials as transparent and public as possible for everyone. Silent legal reprisals in judges' closed chambers gradually became a relic of a dark and unjust past. Gradually, the organisation began to expand its charitable activities, offering not only legal assistance, but also safe temporary housing. Lang rented a spacious house on Harley Street, where fully exonerated women could live until they found new employment. There, they regained their strength, received medical care, and obtained new, solid letters of recommendation on behalf of the society. This brick house became a true stronghold for those whom Victorian society sought to destroy forever and erase from memory. Lang's unique system provided a complete cycle of rescue, from vigorous defense in court to reintegration into normal society. Lang's diplomatic genius and Eastlake's literary talent brought about a seemingly impossible and quiet social revolution. They created a strong legal shield for those who, for decades, had been utterly defenseless against the judicial arbitrariness of London's elite. Their work proved that a rigid system can be changed from within if one acts intelligently, with extreme patience, and with the utmost determination. But how exactly did these legal battles unfold when the society's lawyers first confronted the deceitful landlords? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out how even the most carefully crafted charges crumbled right in the courtroom. What happens if none of the prosecutors are aware of this small but extremely important legal nuance? In the mid-19th century, a typical trial for petty theft usually took no more than 20 minutes. That brief time was enough to read the landlord's testimony, hear the plea of not guilty, and immediately pronounce a harsh sentence. The judge did not even attempt to delve deeply into the details, sincerely believing that the word of a British gentleman was absolute proof of the truth. But with the arrival of the defense attorneys from David Lang's firm, this brief procedure turned into hours of grueling debate. The lawyers began actively employing a new tactic of conducting a detailed examination of the scene of the alleged crime right during the hearings. If the host brazenly claimed that a silver spoon had disappeared from a locked sideboard, the lawyer would demand that the keys be produced immediately. He meticulously investigated who else had constant access to these keys, including cooks, butlers, and family members themselves. It often came to light in court that the keys had been left lying freely on the mantelpiece, and absolutely anyone could have taken the item. This single documented doubt was enough to make the judge question the fairness of the direct and categorical accusations that had been made. The society's lawyers also began to pay incredibly close attention to the very procedure for searching the suspect's personal belongings. By law, the search was to be conducted strictly in the presence of a constable and the accused woman herself, without exception. However, many employers opened the trunks on their own before the police arrived in order to find the planted item without unnecessary witnesses. Lang's lawyers adamantly insisted that such evidence could not be considered lawful or admissible in court. This flawless logic easily dismantled hundreds of poorly fabricated cases at the very earliest stage of the preliminary hearing. The testimony of the other servants who worked full-time in the luxurious London mansion played a particularly important role. Previously, the servants had been afraid to speak out in defense of their dismissed colleague, rightly fearing their employer's wrath and the loss of their own jobs. Lawyers learned to skillfully question ordinary coachmen and maids, uncovering hidden financial motives in the employer's behavior. Sometimes they managed to uncover that the householder had long been threatening to cut back on expenses for maintaining his extensive staff. Such financial details radically altered the perception of the crime in the eyes of the stern bailiff and the jury. The turning point came in the case of Eleanor Wayne herself, for which Lang personally enlisted the capital's finest barrister. The lawyer not only contested the very fact of the shawl's theft, but also demanded the official financial records of the prosecutor's trading firm. In court, it emerged that the respected merchant's business had been on the brink of complete bankruptcy for the past 3 months. This fact brilliantly explained the direct motive for fabricating the case exactly 2 short days before the annual salary was due. The judge, unexpectedly confronted with irrefutable evidence, was forced to fully acquit the shocked and tearful Eleanor. This decision had the effect of a bombshell in London's conservative legal and aristocratic circles. The precedent clearly demonstrated that wealth and high social status no longer guaranteed automatic victory in a property dispute. Judges became much more demanding regarding the evidence, rightly fearing high-profile scandals in the press and pressure from lawyers. Now, A successful prosecution required actual witnesses to the theft, rather than simply an item suddenly found in a travel trunk. The mechanism for easily using criminal charges to evade direct financial obligations began to break down severely throughout the city. Lang always attended many of the hearings in person, sitting quietly in the back row with an open notebook in his hands. His calm and attentive gaze often flustered the arrogant false witnesses, causing them to become thoroughly confused in their fabricated testimony. He meticulously documented every successful ruling by the London court so that Eastlake could later write a detailed article about it. Such publicity made unscrupulous employers think twice before calling the London police to their homes. The risk of public disgrace proved far greater than the desire to illegally save a few dozen pounds a year. Of course, not all court cases ended in an unqualified victory for the charity's experienced defense attorneys. If the fabricated evidence was too convincing and the judge was overly stubborn, the woman would still receive a guilty verdict. In such difficult cases, Lang organized multiple appeals to higher courts, dragging out the process for many months. The grueling legal battles cost the wealthy prosecutors a fortune in daily fees for their own solicitors and barristers. As a result, many employers began withdrawing their complaints, preferring simply to pay the wages owed and part ways amicably. The judicial system slowly but surely began to transform under the constant pressure of these organized legal actions. Lang's lawyers established entirely new standards of defense, which later became the very foundation of British labour law. The relationship between wealthy employers and employees shifted from one of personal arbitrariness to a civilized legal framework. For the first time, women truly felt that they had real power behind them, capable of protecting their professional dignity. The fear of an unfair trial ceased to be a constant companion in their difficult daily working lives. This success in the courtrooms was the major victory for Reverend Lang and Elizabeth Eastlake's team. But to permanently secure this result, it was necessary to change the very economics of such labour contracts. Behind the scenes of these courtroom dramas lay financial mechanisms that compelled the lords to commit crimes. Society had to propose new rules of the game that would satisfy both employers and the female workers themselves. In the next chapter, you'll learn why the Victorian economy made these schemes virtually inevitable. What large companies and wealthy households hide is always tied to precise and ruthless mathematics. Victorian Britain was a country of vast capital, but that capital often existed only on thin bank paper. Many aristocratic families lived on credit for decades, maintaining the illusion of luxury to preserve their high social status. The costs of maintaining a mansion, hosting formal receptions, keeping expensive carriages, and employing a large staff far exceeded their actual income. In this system of total bluff, the wages of hired workers were often paid on a residual and very meagre financial basis. In her articles, Elizabeth Eastlake analysed the economics of a typical London household in the prestigious Mayfair neighbourhood in incredible detail. She used figures to show that the wages of an educated woman constituted a very substantial portion of the family's annual budget. Unlike ordinary cooks or maids, who were paid pennies, such workers demanded a substantial annual salary in sound currency. Delaying these payments for several months was an absolutely common practice, even in the most respected and long-established families. When the debt became truly critical, the employers would frantically seek illegal ways to cancel their financial obligations. David Lang understood perfectly well that the fight had to be waged not only in the courts, but also at the fundamental level of standard contracts. The society began drafting new contracts that would reliably protect the financial interests of both parties without infringing on their rights. These documents specified a clear schedule of monthly payments, rather than vague annual expectations that carried the risk of fraud. If an employer refused to sign such a document, the society strongly recommended that women seek another safe place to work. This practice began to gradually and steadily change hiring standards in the affluent neighbourhoods of Victorian London. The new progressive contracts also included a clause for independent arbitration in the event of any property disputes. This meant that before calling the police, the parties were obligated to involve an official representative of the society to assess the situation. This legal pause prevented landlords from acting impulsively or planting false evidence in a frantic rush. The presence of a third party made covert tampering with the silver spoons extremely difficult and legally risky. The financial gain from a false accusation began to plummet rapidly, failing to compensate in any way for the potential damage to the company's reputation. Eastlake actively promoted these new, reliable contracts through the press, explicitly calling them a hallmark of true British nobility. She wrote that a self-respecting gentleman should never fear transparent financial obligations to his loyal employees. Those families who adopted the new rules immediately gained an unspoken status as reliable and highly reputable employers. The Lang Society even regularly published lists of such landlords as a form of advertising for job seekers. The labour market began to clearly divide into a safe, regulated sector and a grey area of highly dubious contracts. The economic crisis of the early 1950s became a real test for this new, still very fragile system. Many small banks went bankrupt, and wealthy families once again found themselves facing the urgent need to tighten their budgets. However, thanks to the preventive efforts of Lang and Eastlake, a massive wave of false criminal charges was completely averted. The society intervened promptly in any looming conflicts, helping the parties reach a compromise without resorting to criminal court. Women often agreed to defer payments in exchange for ironclad guarantees that their positions and impeccable reputations would be preserved. It was during this difficult period that the society gained immense influence as a reliable financial guarantor and fair arbiter. The accumulated charitable funds allowed Lang to issue small, interest-free loans to those women whose employers had temporarily gone bankrupt. This mutual support completely dismantled the old system of rigid confrontation between the debtor-employer and the powerless worker. Victorian society began to learn how to resolve financial problems in a civilized manner without resorting to iron shackles and filthy prison cells. The financial underbelly of the empire gradually became more transparent, predictable, and fair for all market participants. The work of the Reverend David Lang brilliantly demonstrated that economic reforms are impossible without the creation of reliable social institutions. Harsh laws work only when there are trained people ready to oversee their enforcement in practice. The Relief Society became the most effective instrument of control, forcing the wealthy to play by the common rules. Money ceased to be the ultimate deciding factor in property disputes between the authorities and intellectual workers. This was a colossal and highly significant shift in the public consciousness throughout the entire Victorian era. But how did the incredible story end for those whose fate served as the starting point for all these sweeping reforms? The court case we discussed in detail at the very beginning had an unexpected and very powerful sequel. Eastlake and Lang brought their heroine to a point where true justice finally prevailed. Let's return to that cold November courtroom in London, where a pale Eleanor stood in the dock. The judge was already fully prepared to bring down his wooden gavel and hand down the usual, life-shattering guilty verdict. It was at this dramatic moment that the attorney, hired personally by David Lang for her immediate defense, entered the courtroom. In his confident hands was a thick folder containing authentic financial documents from the chief prosecutor's trading firm. The lawyer began asking the respectable merchant extremely uncomfortable questions about the status of his bank accounts over the past month. The merchant, completely unaccustomed to such treatment, began to get very nervous, blush, and contradict himself in his testimony. The defense attorney methodically and forcefully argued that the motive for the theft claim was not the disappearance of the handkerchief, but a massive gambling debt. He called a witness, a coachman, who confirmed under oath that the master had personally opened Eleanor's trunk late at night the previous evening. The silence in the courtroom instantly gave way to anxious and indignant whispers from the ladies in their expensive silk gowns. The judge, finding himself under unprecedented scrutiny from the press and members of royal society, could not ignore these facts. He slowly set down his gavel and announced Eleanor's full acquittal due to the lack of credible evidence of theft. This was not merely an ordinary acquittal, but a public dismantling of a Victorian scheme of fraud that had been perfected over decades. The merchant left the courtroom in undisguised disgrace, becoming the target of scathing ridicule in the next day's London morning newspapers. Eleanor Wayne stepped out onto the cold street, a completely free woman with an impeccable and officially confirmed reputation. For David Lang, that day marked the greatest historical triumph of his long-standing diplomatic and legal strategy. He brilliantly demonstrated that justice can work to protect the vulnerable if they are provided with competent legal assistance. Elizabeth Eastlake devoted a lengthy article to this unprecedented trial, which forever changed the tone of public discourse in Britain. The organisation received hundreds of new major donations from people impressed by this high-profile and truly remarkable legal victory. The system, which had been ruining lives for decades, suffered a crushing blow at the very heart of the British criminal justice system. Eleanor herself did not return to working in private London mansions after this incredible upheaval. With the Society's support, she opened a small independent school in a very safe green suburb of the capital. Her remarkable journey from victim of a false accusation to owner of her own boarding school became a vivid symbol of the era. She was no longer at the mercy of the whims of the lords and could confidently determine her own financial future. This marked the end of her arduous journey and a magnificent beginning to a new, fully independent life. Such life-affirming stories began to unfold across Britain thanks to the tremendous efforts of the Lang Society's regional chapters. Women who had previously faced nothing but a damp workhouse were given a real chance to clear their names in court. Court records from the late 1950s show a sharp and irreversible decline in the number of such theft cases. Employers finally realized that it was much cheaper and safer to simply terminate the contract and pay the wages owed. Fear of Lang's meticulous lawyers proved to be the best and most reliable regulator of labour relations in the empire. Reverend Lang continued to lead his foundation without interruption until his old age, constantly refining the system of legal protection. His cosy office on Harley Street became a true magnet for anyone in need of support. The struggle for the rights of educated female workers became a crucial step toward the widespread emancipation of women in the 20th century. They learned in practice how to defend their interests, organize into associations, and use the law to their advantage. The invaluable experience gained in the courts of the 19th century laid a solid foundation for future global political demands. A silver spoon could never again overshadow the life of a person armed with knowledge and the support of a strong organization. It was an unqualified victory of dignity over arrogance, a victory of intellect over crude and unprincipled financial power. The story of David Lang, Elizabeth Eastlake, and the hundreds of women they saved is a true triumph of human resilience. They did not resign themselves to their assigned role as victims, but instead created a shield that reliably protected an entire generation of workers. We see that behind the beautiful classic facades of Victorian mansions lay an incredibly brutal economic struggle. The fate of single, educated women depended entirely on the honesty of their employers and the stability of their personal finances. But thanks to outstanding individuals like David Lang and Elizabeth Eastlake, this vulnerability ceased to be an inevitable fate. They built a phenomenally well-crafted system of legal and social protection, using the strict rules of the British elite themselves. Their journey is a brilliant historical example of how cold reason and subtle diplomacy can triumph over arbitrariness. The story of Eleanor Wayne and thousands of other women convincingly demonstrates the critical importance of solidarity and legal literacy. An individual is always vulnerable in the face of great wealth and status, but an organized society is capable of restoring the balance of power. London's court archives have carefully preserved this remarkable transition from complete legal disenfranchisement to respect for human dignity. This historical process proved that justice must be defended based solely on facts, documents, and the highest level of professionalism. Today we take these rights for granted, but in the 19th century, a real battle was waged for them. Every acquittal handed down by a criminal court was a small step toward greater social equality in the foreseeable future. What other professions do you think were subject to similar hidden economic pressure from employers during the Victorian era? In the comments, suggest topics for future videos that you'd like to see in our history series. Let us know what other hidden mechanisms of historical eras you'd be very interested in learning more about. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new, exciting historical investigations from old archives.